Hello. In my talk today, I will draw on my current research project of writing a feminist genealogy of automorphographies, a concept denoting the autobiographical desire of becoming a mathematician, which was coined by Paul Halmus back in 1985. By gendering Halmus' desire, what I argue is that it is essential to throw light onto the social, cultural, and political practices that some women mathematicians deployed in surpassing the restrictions and limitations of their gendered position and follow an academic career in the field of mathematical sciences. In thus working genealogically, I look at the personal, literary, and philosophical writings of 6 women mathematicians, the Italian Maria Gaetana Agnesi, the French Émilie de Châtelet and Sophie Germain, the Scottish Mary Somerville, the English Ada Lovelace, and the Russian Sofia Kovalevskaya. My archival research has also shown that there is a Chinese woman mathematician and astronomer who lived and worked in the 18th century and also wrote poetry and beautiful travel diaries and essays. But apart from some extracts of her work, included in short biographical entries, her writings cannot be translated in English, so I can't have access to them due to language restrictions. I hope that in the future there will be a project that will make her writings accessible to Anglophone readers. But for the time being, I'm just including her in the panorama of women mathematicians in the 18th and 19th centuries, just to mark the need to widen the Western canon. To return to the 6 European women mathematicians, however, apart from their mathematical and scientific work, they wrote philosophical essays like Émilie de Châtelet, Sophie Germain, and Ada Lovelace. Mary Somerville and Sofia Kovalevskaya wrote autobiographies, while Sofia Kovalevskaya also wrote poetry, novels, and theatrical plays. What unites them, however, is that they all wrote letters, so letters have been very important in my research. Letters in general, and epistolary in particular, has been at the heart of my research for several years, and I have written extensively about the intricacies of reading letters in tracing hidden genealogies in women's lives. What I have observed, however, is that the rich body of literature around letters has not considered the importance of scientific correspondences in general and mathematical correspondences in particular in the excavation of the female self, that is, the understanding of the process of becoming a woman mathematician and scientist. I have been struck by this omission, and my talk today is precisely on the importance of letters in writing a feminist genealogy of automorphographies. And just to get it right here, I'm not suggesting that women mathematicians' letters have not been discussed at all. Historians of mathematics have occasionally drawn on letters to examine women's contribution to the history of mathematical sciences, and there have been some publications in this area, although the non-English ones have not been translated, like Kovalevskaya's correspondence with her doctoral supervisor Karl Weierstrass, which is in German, Maria Gaetana Agnesi's correspondence with the Ricati family, which is in Italian, or Amélie du Châtelet's correspondence, which is in French. What we have in all of these cases are some fragments of their letters translated for the purpose of being used as evidence or illustrations of various biographical studies. But such work has been limited in this area, and women mathematicians' letters have not been examined or considered as what Ken Plummer has configured as documents of life, even less so with attention to the epistolary traits of their form. And yet it is important, I argue, to engage with the encounter of what I configure as the personal and the scientific in understanding the formation of the female self in science and mathematics. Let us take an example here from Sophie Germain's correspondence with the famous mathematician Carl Friedrich Gauss. After reading his Disquisitiones Arithmeticae, Germaine decided to write to him because she was very much interested in number theory, and this is how they began a correspondence. But Germaine decided to hide her gender identity and signed her letters to Gauss as Monsieur Leblanc, the name of a student at the École Polytechnique at the time. When the Napoleonic War started, however, and the French troops invaded Prussia, Germaine got worried about Gauss' safety, and through family friends, she asked for his protection. When a French army officer visited his house in Brunswick and told him that his visit was due to his friend Mademoiselle Germaine's concerns, Gauss was puzzled, and subsequently, Germaine wrote to him revealing her gender identity. And here we have her letter, a fragment of it actually. This circumstance prompts me to confess to you that I am not so entirely unknown to you as you believe, but that fearing the ridicule attached to the title of learned women, I borrowed the name of Monsieur Leblanc to write to you and to communicate to you notes which doubtless did not deserve the indulgence with which you were kind enough to answer them. I add a note intended to testify to you that I have a taste for analysis that I developed after reading your work and which inspired me and gave me the confidence of addressing you. And the letter goes on with several pages of mathematical formulas and proofs where Germaine engages with Gauss' work, raises questions, and suggests some solutions. Now, what we have in this letter, as you can see from the beginning, is the confession of a woman that she had been using a man's name to communicate with her correspondent. We also have the understanding that Sophie Germain was afraid of the ridicule, she says, of the learned women. And here, of course, she refers to Molière's comedy Les Femmes Savantes. But as I have written elsewhere in my work, it was not only Germaine, but many other women mathematicians like Maria Gaetana Agnesi and Amélie du Châtelet, who did not want to identify with women who were just very superficially interested in the development of science or mathematics, that they would think mathematics was a good topic for the discussions of their salons. They didn't want to identify with these women. They wanted to be recognized and acknowledged as women mathematicians and scientists in their own right. In responding to her letter, Gauss expresses his admiration about the way she had surpassed the restrictions of her gender in seriously engaging with mathematics. And he writes, amongst others, as you can see, the scholarly notes of which all your letters are so richly filled have given me 1,000 pleasures. I have studied them attentively, and I admire the facility with which you have penetrated all the branches of arithmetic and the sagacity with which you have known how to generalize and perfect them. And then he goes on again after talking about this admiration, after expressing his personal feelings and emotions. Then he goes on with the job, which is their exchanges on mathematics. I beg you to consider as proof of this attention, if I dare add a remark to a place in your last letter. It seems to me that the inverse proposition, namely, if the sum of the nth powers of any two numbers, etc., etc. According to historians of mathematics, this part of Gauss' letter is very important in understanding some very crucial concepts in his number theory. And so again, in his answer, we have this mingling of the personal and the scientific that I have been talking about. So, in thus reading women mathematicians' letters, whether writing to their tutors, supervisors, fellow mathematicians, and even friends or lovers, I have used the lens of what I have configured in my work as epistolary sensibility, meaning the analytical trend of engaging with letters, taking them not just as a document of life amongst others, but paying close attention to their epistolary traits, which include, amongst others, their relational and dialogic character, their ephemerality, the power dynamics of the epistolary relationship, the importance of salutations and greetings, the different time frames of writing a letter, posting it or not, reading it and responding to it or not, the materiality of the epistolary act, as well as the narrative extravagances of letter writing. And so I will now give some examples of the analytical effects of such epistolary sensibilities. Mapping epistolary relationships was important in the analysis of the letters of all 6 women. A common denominator in all 6 cases was that women mathematicians were communicating with men, mostly, whether tutors, doctoral supervisors, fellow mathematicians, or even family members, lovers, and friends when writing about mathematics. The only exception was the correspondence between Mary Somerville and Ada Lovelace. And I have written a paper about this case and its importance in understanding the power of mentorship among women mathematicians. What has also struck me in mapping epistolary relationships among women themselves is, for example, that Amélie du Châtelet and Maria Gaetana Agnesi, although they lived during the same periods in France and Italy, respectively, never communicated with each other. And yet they knew of each other's work. Agnesi had Du Châtelet's book in her library. Du Châtelet had praised Agnesi's work, and they had become members of the Bologna Academy of Sciences at around the same time through their connections with Laura Bassi, the first woman to hold a chair in physics in the early modern period. In the same way, Mary Somerville never got to meet Sophie Germain, although she visited Paris in 1817, just a year after Germain had become the first woman to be awarded the Grand Prix de Mathématiques from the Paris Academy of Sciences. Although Somerville dined and wined with the members of the scientific community that had actually read Germain's work and had awarded her the prize. How would things might have been different if the few women mathematicians in 18th and 19th century Europe had been in communication, I have wondered, particularly thinking of contemporary attempts to create and sustain such networks of support among associations of women in mathematics all over the world. Epistolary education was an important theme in the analysis of these correspondences, and it was often the case that letters filled the gaps of most women's lack of rigorous mathematics education, as well as their exclusion from universities and formal learned academies. In this context, some of their letters function as educational and pedagogical tools in the circuit of knowledge production and dissemination, but also as flexible spaces of self-definition, as well as spaces of encouragement and disguise, sometimes even bracketing race, class, and age differences. If we remember, for example, that Sophie Germain was able to hide her gender identity in her mathematical correspondence, first with the professors of the École Polytechnique and then with Carl Friedrich Gauss, we can understand how epistolarity was a space of scientific communication, but at the same time a hideout for gender differences that could jeopardize a young woman's possibility to imagine herself as a member of the scientific republic of letters. Many of the letters that women mathematicians received were instructional, carrying didactic epistolary characteristics, and as Marie-Claire Grassi has argued, the instructive letter is a literary genre in its own right. Roland Bonnel has further coined the term of the laboratory letter, la lettre laboratoire, in his work with Amélie du Châtelet's letters, suggesting that these letters should be taken as sites where she conducted experiments. Taking this idea further, Ariane Nicole Margolin has dissected the notion of the Châtelet's epistolary laboratory by meticulously showing how the laboratory, the site par excellence of the scientist's work, was transposed within the context of the epistolary form. I have used the lens of the laboratory letter in the mathematical correspondences of all 6 women, But my focus was not on mathematical formulas and proofs, but rather on tracing the process of becoming a mathematician and scientist by following women's questions in their letters, the problems they followed, even the geographical schemata that they drew. What also transpires from women mathematicians' epistolary education is a spirit of agonism, not in its usual connotation as struggle and contestation, but rather in its Arendtian configuration as affirmative action towards achievement, creation, and recognition in the world of science and mathematics in our case. As I have written elsewhere at length, the few women mathematicians that emerged in the early and late modern periods in Europe were not exceptional minds or geniuses, as the dominant discourses of their times have deemed them to be, but simply hard-working minds in the wider process of what I have configured as the agonistics of knowledge and learning. Their letters carry traces of this agonal spirit and show how their agon was a constitutive element of the process of becoming a woman mathematician, scientist, and philosopher in the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe. So, in this slide, we have two examples of this agonal spirit. In the first letter, Émilie du Châtelet writes to her tutor, Maupertuis, an established academician, and her friend about her decision to submit an essay on the nature of fire, taking part in one of the scientific contests of the Royal Academy of Sciences. I think you were quite surprised that I had the audacity to compose a memoir for the Academy. I wanted to try out my strength in the shelter of incognito because I was flattering myself to never be known. I was unable to make any experiments because I was working without the knowledge of Monsieur de Voltaire, and I could not have hidden them from him. I fought almost all of his ideas in my work. So what this letter actually says is that although du Châtelet was Voltaire's lover, as it is well known, they lived together in her Chateau de Cirey, and they were philosophizing, writing, and conducting experiments. When she understood that Voltaire's take on the nature of fire was wrong, she decided to submit an essay without telling him that she was going to do, and take part in a very prestigious competition. As a matter of fact, neither du Châtelet nor Voltaire won this competition. It was actually won by Euler. But because their essays were very good, the Academy decided to publish them in their proceedings. So eventually, du Châtelet became the first woman whose work was published by the French Academy of Sciences. And to do that and achieve this, she had not only to hide her identity, but also to expose herself in what Arendt celebrates as the public sphere where citizens appear and compete with each other. And although Arendt, of course, in her work on agonism refers to the political arena, what we have here is Duchatelet's appearance in the scientific arena, which is also public, and striving for acknowledgement and recognition. In the second letter, we have an example of what we have already referred to, meaning women mathematicians' reluctance to identify with the superficial learned women of the salons of their times. So Duchatelet writes to Maupertuis again about the event of the publication of Francesco Algarotti's book Il Newtonismo per le Dame, Newtonianism for Women, which was what its title says. It was a book where Algarotti used Newton's ideas on optics to explain in simple words what Newtonian ideas were about, and his audience was, as the title says, women. Algarotti also was a friend of Duchatelet's. He had actually visited her Chateau de Cirey, and they had communicated with letters, so they were at least epistolary friends. But the publication of his book deeply disappointed Duchatelet, because she felt that such a book was demeaning for women like her who were seriously engaged with mathematics in general and Newton's theory in particular. And this is what she writes to Maupertuis. Monsieur Algarotti is in Toulouse and perhaps now in Paris. His book is frivolous. It's a fontanelle monkey which has graces. The sixth dialogue is quite well done. The rest is diffuse and quite empty of things. He will be able to succeed in the boudoirs and not be despised by people who know. The desire to give a rival to Newton's elements will do him good. So she's very dismissive of the book and of the idea of popularizing science for women, which was something that started from Fontenelle. That's why her reference is to Fontenelle, but was taken up by many authors at the time. So, women's position in the educational epistolary relationships also had temporalities, meaning variations and changes over time. Amélie de Châtelet, for example, in the beginning of her correspondence with Maupertuis, positioned herself as a schoolgirl, écolière, despite her aristocratic status. I have studied a lot, and I hope you will be a bit less displeased with me than last time, she wrote to him on a Monday between January and February 1734. In a later letter during the same period, she complained about being neglected. You don't want to encourage a schoolgirl because I still don't know if you found my work good, she wrote. Later on, when her mathematical knowledge advanced and her critical thought deepened, the tutor became a scientific advisor. I have taken up, sir, the sweet habit of writing to you for all the posts, and I cannot detach myself from it, even today, that I have no pretext to send a letter to you. I confess that I am a little annoyed to consult you from afar, she wrote on January 26, 1739, while sending Maupertuis a long list of questions about his book, La figure de la Terre. In the final phase of their correspondence, when she was preparing the publication of her Foundations of Physics, they eventually became colleagues who were discussing, debating, and had ultimately agreed to disagree. I did not expect you to become Leibnizian, nor that the monads would conquer you. I do not know, however, if the metaphysical ideas which are at the beginning of the book do not at least deserve to be known. She wrote from Brussels on August 8, 1841. During this time, she had more and more distanced herself from Newton and adopted some of Leibniz's ideas, particularly around the famous debate on the living forces. And Maupertuis and Voltaire still were holding the Newtonian castle, so there was a tension in their relationship because of this difference. Salutations and greetings mark subject positions in the epistolary relationship. And we have here in this slide the best epistolary ending of my whole archival research, I dare say. Ever yours mathematically, Ada Byron, later Lovelace, and a letter to a family friend, a girl she had decided to teach mathematics. The Byron-Lovelace correspondence is indeed very interesting in terms of how epistolary salutations and greetings mark power relations. Despite her young age, Ada is almost always addressed as my dear Lady Lovelace, even by the much older and accomplished mathematicians and scientists like her friend and mentor Mary Somerville or Charles Babbage, the inventor of the calculating machine, for which Ada later became famous. Interestingly enough, she's interpolated as my dear kid in her husband's letters. And although this might just be a phrase of familiarity, the way her mother also addresses her in her letters is very enfatizing, and there is much more to be said and studied around salutations if we had time for all 6 women. Women mathematicians' letters unfold within the dominant philosophical discourse of their times, didactics, as we have already seen, but also polemics. Let's have a look at the polemical epistolary form, where we identify, amongst other features, open dialogues, an ironic tone, but also, and perhaps most importantly, a simple style, a refined argumentation, since the aim of the polemical letter is, after all, to convince its recipient that the letter writer has mastered the subject. And our first example here comes from Maria Gaetana Agnesi. And I read the letter to her philosophy tutor, Michele Cassati, written on December 19, 1739. Everything went according to His Highness' wishes. The evening after our arrival, the prince came to our house. He heard from me, to his great enjoyment, a dispute that I made with Father Branconi after the cause of the motion of the planets, and another with Father Stampa about the nature of colors. Then he heard Teresa singing and playing the harpsichord. And then both of us together also played for him a melody on that sweet musical instrument which borrows its name from love, so that he could sleep well at night, having filled his eyes with pleasurable visions. Agnesi's ironic tone in this letter is an expression of her rebellion against her imposed condition as a spectacle. Agnesi came from a family of rich silk merchants in Milano, and her father used his daughter's prodigious talent to promote his social positioning and his desire to be recognized amongst the Milanese nobility. So what he did was to organize conversazioni in his palazzo. Conversazioni were something like conversation clubs, very similar to the more well-known figure of the Salon. And in this conversazioni, he was inviting not just the Milanese nobility, but also famous visitors in Milan to come and listen to his daughter conversing with mathematicians and scientists about the scientific problems of their times, which included, as we see in the letter, the motion of the planets, the nature of colors, the waves, etc., etc. And these scientific conversations were always accompanied by music, because his other daughter, Teresa Agnesi, was not only a very good pianist, but also she was a composer. And she's actually included in the very few women composers of the early modern period. So Agnesi and her sister were the spectacles, Italian Marta Cavaggia has written about this phenomenon of the specularization of knowledge in Italy in the early modern period, and the implications that these spectacles had on the debates around women's ability to learn, or women's right to education, or women's contribution to the arts and music. So Agnesi was, of course, a very dutiful daughter, and she could not simply say no to her father's wishes. But we see in her letters how much disturbed she was by the fact that she was asked to perform. As a matter of fact, later in life, She developed a kind of illness, this resulted in an agreement between her and her father to stop these performances and devote herself to serious study. And this is when she actually engaged with the study of mathematics and became the first woman in Europe to publish a mathematical textbook. In the second example, we have again an extract from Amélie de Châtelet's letter to Maupertuis, where she talks about her correspondence with the secretary of the French Academy of Sciences, de Mayran, again over their dispute on the living forces. I believe that the journals don't even mention Mayran's letter and mine. He apparently has found that it would be easier for them to impose silence than to let the letters speak for themselves. I swear to you that I am angry about this, which seems to me to be a joke that I don't want people to forget. And she refers here, of course, to a number of public letters she exchanged with de Mayran on the topic of living forces, and this correspondence eventually stopped because de Mayran decided that silence was better. He was obviously losing the epistolary battle, and he had to do something to put an end to it. De Châtelet's scientific correspondence became instrumental in the production and dissemination of knowledge, sustained her relations with a wider mathematical community in Europe, and ultimately forged her self-representation as a scholarly persona. Du Châtelet was a voluminous correspondent, however, and the forms and types of her letters are polyvalent and multifunctional. Indeed, her letters are important autobiographical documents, seizing moments of the everyday, dealing with worldly issues and business affairs, and carrying marks of socio-economic, historical, and political experiences, formations, and circumstances. Apart from the letters of the everyday, there are letters to friends and confidants, where existential questions are raised and confessions are made. There are also philosophical letters, evoking subjects of a cultural nature in the traditional style of literary correspondences of her time. And last but not least, there are her love letters, where discursive expressions of intense passions and feelings are etched, but also struggles with the beloved are staged, dreams unfold, and future plans are made. Taken together as Wortley Stanley has theorized an epistolarium, her letters utterly chart a map where the process of becoming a woman mathematician, scientist, and philosopher can be traced. And we have here some examples of these letters. Du Châtelet writes to her lover, Saint-Labert, in June 1748. I always try to keep my soul in such a situation that I find resources in my courage, in my philosophy, and especially in my love for study if you abandon me. And we know from her philosophical treatise on happiness that she wrote that after a certain age, women have to resort to their love for study because this is a love that can never be in danger of being retracted. So her advice to women is to study and cling on this love to maintain and sustain their happiness. And we also have another letter of hers, which is written earlier in the same month, and where she tries to persuade her lover that it would not be a good idea for her to leave Paris, where she was in full swing of completing her publication, her translation of a commentary on Newton's Principia. Because she wanted to finish it in time. If I go, so that's what she writes. If I go to Syria this fall or soon, I will have to come back here this winter to see Monsieur de Russellier and for my Newton, which is a very serious matter and very essential for me. I can't work on it now. My head is so upside down. I'm only vegetating, and I only feel that I'm able to think and feel because I love you. So she is passionate in love, but at the same time she understands that this corporeal and earthy love might become an obstacle in the completion of her book. So I have written a whole paper about it, and what I say, what is strange here, is that the rivalry is not between her lover and her husband, or two lovers even, but actually it is between her lover and her Newton, who was actually the great love of her life, as we can see. In thus contributing to a wider field, acknowledging the diversity of women's letter writing practices, I have followed existential trails of love as a creative force in the field of gender and science. And we can see in this slide some examples of such entanglements between love and mathematics. In further reading women mathematicians' correspondences, I have used the lens of what I have configured as narrative rhythm analysis in discerning the echo of the subject. There is no space or time within the limitations of this talk to expand on the theoretical and methodological approach of narrative rhythm analysis, but I have written about this elsewhere in my work. What I argue is that narrative rhythm analysis brings to the fore the catalytic role of space-time matter and opens up new analytical paths and insights. As it engages with texts and subjects, narrative rhythm analysis can never be conclusive, however. It is rather a process constantly unearthing new signs and meanings around subjects, their echo, and their worlds. And again, we have two examples, one from Sofia Kovalevskaya, who writes to her friend Yulia Lermontova in January 1869. I will not wait. I want to go abroad and study with you, Yulia. I cannot imagine a happier existence than a quiet, modest life in some forgotten corner of Germany or Switzerland, among books and studies. And this is, in this letter, we have an echo, I argue, of Sofia Kovalevskaya's subjectivity, because we know that this dream did become true. Sophia was able to leave Russia because she got married to a young man, Kovalevsky, who agreed to become her husband in a white marriage, just to give her the opportunity to travel, because she couldn't do it otherwise. She could only, as a woman, she could only travel either in the company of her parents or in the company of her husband. So her husband, Volodya, not only saved her, but also her sister Anyuta, who traveled with her, later went to Paris, and she became one of the leading figures of the Parisian Commune. But also her husband, her so-called husband, also liberated Julia, because as her closest friend, she was allowed to be in Germany with her. And she actually became, while Kovalevskaya became the first woman to get a PhD in mathematics, Julia became the first woman to get a PhD in chemistry. And both got it from the University of Göttingen in 1874, only 5 years after this letter was written. And in the second example, we have a very strong statement, again, by Émilie de Châtelet, writing to Frederick the Great, who was, as we know, a friend of Voltaire's and a philosopher himself. I am my own person and only responsible to myself for everything I am, what I say, and what I do. There may be metaphysicians and philosophers whose knowledge is greater than mine. I haven't met them yet. But even if they are only weak human beings, but even they are only weak human beings with faults, and when I count my gifts, I think I may say that I am inferior to none. And this is a very strong statement, but also an exemplar of how these women were asserting themselves and indeed inscribing themselves as philosophers and scientists of their time through self-representational modes. And letters was one of these very strong self-representation mode. To conclude, what I have argued in this talk is that women mathematicians' letters and correspondences have been mainly discussed and analyzed in terms of the mathematical problems that they have tackled and addressed, as well as evidence of their overall contribution to the history of mathematical sciences. At the same time, their personal letters, like de Châtelet's love letters, have been mainly read as extravagant narratives. But while the personal and the political is a recurrent motive in feminist theories and research, the couplet of the personal and the scientific has not been considered in the literature of gender and science, with the exception of the theme of domesticity in science. And here we have another example of the mingling of the personal and the scientific in Sophie Zerman's letter to her friend and fellow mathematician Guglielmo Libri, written in September 18, 26. I'm not surprised at your eagerness to renew conversations that cannot be found elsewhere than in Paris. All the doors are open to you. As I'm not allowed to go to any sessions, I find myself almost as foreign to the movement of science as if I lived in another country. And yet I prefer to be here even more than elsewhere, because sometimes it happens to me to find by chance an opportunity to instruct myself. You would perhaps not believe that being in the middle of Paris, I cannot succeed in seeing Monsieur Savard, who has made 1,000 interesting experiments. He shows them to people who can make no use of them. These facts are in my domain and mine alone, but they stay hidden. Here is the privilege of the ladies. They obtain compliments and no real advantages. And the letter, of course, goes on with mathematical issues and problems and news from their community. But what we have here again is a very rare moment when we can listen to the echo of Germaine's subjectivity. We can feel her frustration about the fact that she was a recognized mathematician, but she was still in the margins of the scientific community in Paris. And given the fact that we have no autobiography or any other personal writing from Sophie Germain, these rare fragments of her letters become the only windows through which we can have a glimpse in the process of her constitution as a subject. What are then the effects of considering the personal and the scientific in women mathematicians' letters? In the same way that the personal and the political cannot be separated, the personal and the scientific create conditions of possibility for each other in their entanglement as components of the female self in science. In this light, all 6 biographical cases show that personal conditions played a huge role in how these women became mathematicians, scientists, and philosophers. For some of them, personal conditions, but also feelings and emotions can be traced in their autobiographies, as in the case of Mary Somerville and Sofia Kovalevskaya. Personal letters, as in the case of Amélie de Châtelet, Mary Somerville, Ada Lovelace, and Sofia Kovalevskaya, as well as in their philosophical and scientific writings. Their introductions are particularly illuminating here. We don't have personal letters or autobiographies for Maria Gaetana Agnesi and Sophie Germain. Anything personal we can trace about them is either folded in the memories of people who knew them, or is entangled in the pages of their scientific correspondence, as well as in their scientific and philosophical writings. What is important to acknowledge, however, in all cases, is that the personal and the scientific cannot be separated or disentangled, and this acknowledgement is important in the overall process of tracing the constitution of the female self in the field of gender and science. What also emerges from this acknowledgement is the complexity of these 6 women's archives and meta-archives, as well as the polyvalent discourses and mythologies that have been created around them. What I argue is that a careful study and analysis of their letters, in the light of epistolary sensibility, is catalytic not only in hearing the echo of the female self in science, but also in deconstructing the myths that have been woven around them. Thank you.